All right, let's dive into a really crucial topic in Hindu law. We're going to tackle this big question. If a Hindu female dies without a will, who gets her property? Now, you might think there's a simple answer, but it's actually not a one-size-fits-all situation. It all boils down to a very specific set of rules in the Hindu Succession Act, and by the end of this, you're going to know exactly how to navigate them. So here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the general rule of inheritance, the default setting. Then we'll dig into two critical exceptions that completely depend on where the property came from. We'll see how this works in a real court case, and then wrap it all up by getting clear on who legally counts as an heir. So this is it, the central question we're trying to answer. But here's the twist. The law doesn't give you a single straight answer. Nope. Instead, the very first thing you have to do is ask a totally different question. A question that will send the inheritance down one of a few completely different paths. Okay, let's start with that default path I mentioned. This is what we call the general rule, and you'll find it laid out in Section 15, subsection 1 of the Hindu Succession Act. Think of this as the rule that applies most of the time, but definitely not all the time. But hold on. Before we can even start talking about heirs, we have to take a step back and categorize the property itself. The law makes us play detective and investigate its origin, sorting it into one of three different buckets, or what the law calls heads. And here are those three buckets. First, property she inherited from her parents. Second, property she inherited from her husband or father-in-law. And third, property from literally any other source. This last one is a big catch-all. It includes her own salary, investments she made, self-acquired stuff, or gifts from a friend. Getting this categorization right is, and I mean this, everything. Okay, so if the property falls into that third bucket we just talked about, the self-acquired or any other source one, that's when we apply the general rule of succession you see here in Section 15.1. This is our starting point, our baseline. And here's the order of who gets what. First in line are her children, any grandkids from children who passed away before her, and her husband. Now here's the crucial part. If there is anyone, even just one person in this first category, the story ends right there. They take everything. If not, only then do we move down to Category 2, the husband's heirs, and so on down the list. An heir in a higher category always excludes everyone below them. But you knew there was a but coming, right? This is where it gets really interesting, and honestly, where most law students get tested. That general rule we just covered, it gets completely thrown out the window if the property was inherited from her parents or from her husband's family. So let's jump into the first major exception. You'll find this in Section 15, subsection 2, Clause A. This is all about what happens when the property she owned was something she inherited specifically from her mom or dad. Now pay close attention to the fine print here. This exception only kicks in if the female dies without leaving any children or grandchildren. See, if she has direct descendants, they inherit, and we don't even care where the property came from. But if she doesn't have any kids, the law's logic is to return the property to the bloodline it came from. So it goes back to the heirs of her father, not over to our husband's family. And the second exception under Section 15.2.2 is basically the other side of the same coin. It covers property that she inherited from her husband or her father-in-law. This table really makes the logic pop. When the deceased female has no children, the source of the property is the only thing that matters. Did it come from her parents? It goes back to her father's heirs. Did it come from her husband's family? It goes to her husband's heirs. The law is trying to keep the property within the family it originally belonged to. Simple as that. Theory is great, but let's see how this all plays out in the real world. The case of Dhanistha Kalida v. Ramakanta Kalida is a perfect example of why figuring out the property's source is the absolute most important first step. All right, let's break down this family situation. We have a man named Shamraj who had two wives. From his first wife, he had a daughter named Tali. His second wife was Maheshwari. So when Shamraj passed away, his property was divided between Tali and Maheshwari. Then, sometime later, Maheshwari also passed away, and she had no children. The whole legal fight was about who now inherits Maheshwari's share. The court's logic was crystal clear. They started by asking that one magic question. Where did Maheshwari's property come from? And the answer was simple. She inherited it from her husband, Shamraj. Since she died childless, Section 15.2b automatically kicked in. The property had to go to the heirs of her husband. In this case, that meant Shamraj's other heirs, who were Tali's sons. It didn't go to Maheshwari's own relatives. The source was paramount.
And this idea was really cemented in another major case, Bhagat Ram v. Tija Singh. This quote sums up the entire philosophy behind the law perfectly. The whole point of these exceptions is to prevent property from going to people who are, complete strangers to the person who originally owned it.
All right, we're almost there. Let's just quickly clear up some really important definitions so we know exactly who we're talking about when we say heir in these different situations. When the law says sons and daughters, it has a very particular meaning. And as you can kind of see from these notes here, the definition is pretty broad in some ways, but it also has one very important exclusion. So, who's in? For the purposes of inheriting directly from a woman, the term children includes her legitimate children, illegitimate children, and adopted children. But, and this is a classic exam question, who's out? Stepchildren. A stepchild does not inherit directly from their stepmother. Now, they might still inherit eventually, but it would be through a different door as an heir of the husband a little further down the line. So, as we wrap up, let's bring it all back home. If you remember only one thing from this entire explainer, let it be this. When you are faced with a Hindu female succession problem, the very first question out of your mouth should always be, where did the property come from?
So here it is, your practical 3-step roadmap. Step 1, are there any surviving children or grandchildren? If the answer is yes, stop right there. They inherit, and the source doesn't matter. If the answer is no, you move to step 2. What is the source of the property? And finally, step 3, apply the correct rule based on that source. Is it the general rule, the parental source rule, or the marital source rule?
And I'll leave you with one final question to really chew on, to take your understanding to the next level. What happens if a woman inherits a house from her father, sells it, and then uses that exact money to buy a new apartment? Does that new apartment keep the character of the original inheritance and still fall under that parental exception? Or has it become self-acquired property, meaning the general rule now applies? That's a tricky question the courts have had to deal with, and it's your next step to truly mastering this topic.